Move that piece of junk out of the way. What's that rusty old truck doing in the center of the lot? The elderly man remained seated behind the wheel, his weathered hand resting on the key. Suddenly, the passenger door opened, and a man in full military dress uniform stepped out, standing tall beside the truck. Why would a general emerge from the vehicle of an old man who had just been disrespected? Type 1 if you believe some people quietly carry the weight of others, yet never receive a word of thanks. Welcome to QH. Let's uncover what really happened. Calvin Rhodes, 78, was a former logistics driver for the military who had retired back in 1981. His service record, 3 tours of duty spanning decades, remained folded in his drawer, yellowing with age and forgotten by all but him. Since his wife Lillian passed away 5 years ago, Calvin lived alone in their modest single-story home with faded siding and a meticulously maintained garden. The garden was Lillian's legacy. The rusty blue-silver pickup truck in the driveway was Calvin's. He rarely drove these days. His arthritic knees protested every time he climbed into the cab, and his pension barely covered gas. But on Fridays without fail, Calvin fired up the old Ford and drove to the community center downtown to collect his Veterans Food Assistance box. This particular Friday morning was unusually warm for early October. Calvin dressed with care, pressed khaki pants, a button-down shirt that had seen better days but remained crisp from ironing, and his old leather work boots polished to a dull shine. No point in letting standards slip, Lillian would have said. The tuk coughed twice before the engine caught, a familiar mechanical protest that Calvin had learned to interpret over their 27 years together. He patted the dashboard affectionately. "Just a few miles today, old girl," he murmured. "You can manage that." Downtown had changed dramatically since his younger days. New office buildings with reflective glass facades towered over the few remaining brick structures. The community center, once a proud centerpiece of civic life, now stood overshadowed by a luxury apartment complex next door. Calvin guided his truck into the parking lot, wincing as a fresh twinge shot through his left knee. The closest spaces were marked for staff or VIP parking. With his limited mobility, the thought of limping across the entire lot seemed daunting. After a moment's hesitation, he pulled into one of the empty VIP spaces. It was early. He'd be in and out before anyone important arrived. He had just switched off the engine when a gleaming black SUV pulled up alongside him. The vehicle probably cost more than Calvin had earned in his final decade of work. Its driver, a middle-aged man in an expensive suit, stepped out, his face contorted in obvious displeasure. "Hey," he called, voice sharp with entitled anger. "What do you think you're doing? This isn't parking for junk heaps. Move it out now." Several people near the community center entrance turned to watch. Calvin felt heat rise in his cheeks. Not from anger, but from shame. He hadn't meant to cause trouble. His hand moved to the ignition key, ready to retreat. He began quietly. The man cut him off. "That truck belongs in a scrapyard, not taking up space where important people park. Back it up now." Calvin turned the key, but before the engine could catch, the passenger door, which he was certain he'd been alone in the truck, swung open. A tall figure emerged, unfolding with military precision. The morning sunlight gleamed off polished brass insignia and decorations that adorned a perfectly pressed Air Force dress uniform. The man stood ramrod straight beside Calvin's truck, facing the angry driver of the SUV. The parking lot fell silent. The suited man took an involuntary step backward, his expression shifting from anger to confusion. The uniformed officer surveyed the scene calmly before speaking in a clear, authoritative voice. "I'm going to request that nobody touches this vehicle. The man sitting inside once saved my life." Calvin remained in the driver's seat, head bowed slightly, bewildered by what was happening around him. If you believe some people silently shoulder the burden for entire teams, yet never receive a word of thanks, stay with us. The man in uniform was General Wesley Hart, commander of the 39th Air Wing, a unit that had seen multiple deployments throughout the Middle East conflicts. His presence at the community center was no accident, nor was his emergence from Calvin's passenger seat. 20 years earlier, when Hart had been a lieutenant leading a small reconnaissance team, their transport vehicle had become stranded in a deteriorating urban combat zone. Enemy fire had intensified as night approached, communications were spotty, and their extraction point had been compromised. The only person who dared drive into the hot zone to retrieve them was Calvin Rhodes, then a 58-year-old logistics specialist, who should have been safely behind the lines coordinating supply route. Wesley had never forgotten that evening, the whistle of incoming rounds, the choking dust, the growing certainty that his team wouldn't make it out, then the rumble of an approaching engine. impossibly loud in the wrong part of the city. A battered transport truck had appeared through the smoke, skidding to a halt beside their disabled vehicle. The driver had leaned out, face streaked with dust, eyes sharp with determination. "Get your asses in here now," Calvin had shouted over the gunfire. "I've navigated worse than this in Khe-San. This is just a morning exercise by comparison." They'd piled in 6 soldiers with equipment, as Calvin executed a perfect 3-point turn under fire. A round had punched through the windshield, missing Calvin's head by inches. He hadn't even flinched, just kept driving with the same unwavering focus. "Where is your extraction?" Calvin had asked. When told their planned exit route was likely compromised, he'd nodded once. "I know another way. Hang on." For 20 tense minutes, Calvin had navigated through narrow alleys and debris-strewn streets, somehow avoiding both ambushes and patrols. He delivered them safely to the secondary extraction point, waited until their helicopter arrived, then disappeared back into the chaos to help others. Wesley had tried to get his name, to ensure he received recognition, but in the confusion of extraction and subsequent deployment rotations, Calvin had become just another hero without a face, until last month. During a routine review of veteran support services in the region, General Hart had spotted a familiar name on the assistance roster. Further investigation confirmed it was the same Calvin Rhodes. Not only that, but Calvin still drove the civilian version of the same model truck he'd operated in the service. Though it was now rusted and worn from years of use, Wesley had made discreet arrangements. This morning he'd asked his driver to drop him at Calvin's modest home before the elderly man departed for the community center. "Mr. Rhodes," he'd said, standing on the porch. "You won't remember me, but Lieutenant Hart," Calvin had interrupted, recognition dawning slowly, "though I suspect that's not your rank anymore." His eyes had taken in the stars on Wesley's uniform. "General now," Wesley had confirmed. "May I ride with you today?" Calvin had seemed confused by the request. "It's just my food pickup day, nothing special." "You mentioned you didn't have anyone to accompany you," Wesley had replied. "Today you do." The drive had been mostly silent, Calvin occasionally pointing out landmarks that had changed over the decade. He hadn't asked why a general wanted to ride in his rusted truck, and Wesley hadn't volunteered the information. Then came the confrontation in the parking lot. When the man in the SUV had begun berating Calvin, Wesley had made an instantaneous decision. This man who had saved him, and his team without hesitation or recognition, deserved to be defended with the same decisiveness. Now as everyone in the parking lot stared, General Hart stood protectively beside Calvin's truck. The man from the SUV faltered, suddenly uncertain. I didn't realize." "Few people do," General Hart replied evenly. "That's often true of the most important among us." He turned toward Calvin, who remained seated behind the wheel, visibly uncomfortable with the attention. "Mr. Rhodes was driving logistics when most of you were learning to walk." The general continued, addressing the small crowd that had gathered. "He extracted my team under heavy fire when no one else would attempt it. 6 lives saved in 20 minutes of perfect driving." Calvin finally spoke, his voice quiet. "You don't need to do this, General. It was a long time ago." "Time doesn't diminish valor, sir," Wesley replied formally. "And I've waited 20 years to properly thank you." The man from the SUV had retreated to his vehicle, embarrassment evident in his hurried movements. Others in the parking lot watched in respectful silence. Wesley extended his hand toward Calvin. "Will you allow me to accompany you inside, Mr. Rhodes? I believe they're expecting us both." Calvin slowly emerged from the truck, his movements stiff from arthritis. He stood straight despite his discomfort, an instinctive response to the uniform before him. Together they walked toward the community center entrance, an unlikely pair that commanded attention, simply by their contrast. The decorated general in pristine uniform, and the elderly man in his worn but dignified clothing. Behind them, no one approached the rusty truck. It remained where Calvin had parked it, suddenly transformed in everyone's perception, from an eyesore to a symbol of something they couldn't quite articulate but instinctively respected. Have you ever seen someone silently help others only to receive acknowledgement 20 years later, that left an entire crowd speechless? Share such a moment. Within days, security camera footage capturing General Hart standing at attention beside Calvin's truck spread across social media. The video, initially shared by a community center employee, quickly accumulated millions of views. Comments poured in by the thousands. "This is what real respect looks like. The general knows what matters. Who cares about a parking space when you owe someone your life? Find someone who defends you like this." General defends his driver. The man who had confronted Calvin became the subject of public criticism. his behavior dissected and condemned as emblematic of declining societal value. Several veterans groups called for a formal apology, though Calvin himself, when contacted by local news, dismissed the need. He didn't know, Calvin said simply, no harm done. But as interest in the story grew, journalists began investigating. Who exactly was the man driving the old pickup truck? What they uncovered surprised even those who thought they understood military service and sacrifice. Calvin Rhodes had served not one but 3 consecutive tours during the Vietnam conflict, volunteering for the third when he could have returned home. As a logistics specialist, he had driven some of the most dangerous routes through hostile territory, ensuring supplies reached forward operating bases when conventional transport wouldn't risk the journey. His personnel file, obtained through Freedom of Information requests, revealed 17 citations for extraordinary service under adverse conditions. Yet he had never received a single medal of recognition. Each recommendation had been met with the same note in Calvin's handwriting: respectfully declined. Was only performing required duties. A deeper investigation uncovered more remarkable details. During his second tour, Calvin had established an unofficial shuttle service for wounded soldiers, driving them to field hospitals during his supposed rest period. He'd modified his truck with extra padding and medical supplies purchased with his own money. Military records indicated he had transported over 300 injured personnel this way, yet had never included these voluntary missions in his official report. He called it his evening commute, recalled a retired medic who had served alongside Calvin, like it was nothing special. But those extra minutes saved lives that would have been lost waiting for official medical transport. When asked about this by an increasingly intrigued media, Calvin shrugged. Medals are for heroes. I just drove trucks where they needed to go. But General Hart had a different perspective. Mr. Rhodes's definition of required duties included driving into active combat zones when no one else would, he explained during a press conference. His modesty has prevented proper recognition for decades. The following week, at the headquarters of the 139th Air Wing, a special ceremony was arranged specifically to honor Calvin. Despite his protests, he found himself seated in the front row of the base auditorium, surrounded by active duty personnel and veterans alike. General Hart, addressing the assembled crowd, recounted the rescue that had saved his life and those of his team members. When I was disoriented in a red zone, he didn't ask who I was, the general said. He simply pulled me into his truck and said, I've hauled more important people than you out of hell before. The audience chuckled, but Calvin blinked in surprise. He had no memory of saying those words. They had been just another moment in a career full of split-second decisions and forward movement. Then came the ceremony's unexpected revelation. General Hart called forward 5 other service members of varying ages and ranks, from a young sergeant to a retired colonel. These individuals all share something in common, the general explained. Each one was extracted from danger by Mr. Rhodes during different conflicts in different decades. Each one went on to save others, to lead crucial missions, to return home and raise families who now serve. One by one, they approached Calvin, sharing brief accounts of moments he had largely forgotten, routine missions to him that had been life-altering for them. You pulled my unit out of an ambush in '72, said the retired colonel. I was a frightened private then. Because of you, I lived to command hundreds and bring them all home safely. 203 outside Fallujah, said a major with prosthetic leg. Our transport hit an IED. You appeared like a ghost through the smoke. 8 of us made it out because of your driving. A woman in civilian clothes approached next. I never met you, Mr. Rhodes, she said, but the colonel you saved in '72 was my father. He came home because of you. 3 generations of my family exist because you drove into danger that day. The ripple effect of Calvin's just doing my job extended further than anyone could have imagined. A military historian present at the ceremony estimated that Calvin's direct actions had saved at least 412 lives during his career, with an exponential impact on subsequent generations. Calvin sat stunned. His mind struggled to reconcile these stories with what he had always considered just doing his job. The ceremony culminated with General Hart personally presenting Calvin with the Distinguished Service Cross, an honor Calvin had been recommended for 3 separate times during his career, but had always declined. This time, Mr. Rhodes, we're not accepting your refusal, the general said firmly. Some debts must be acknowledged even decades later. As the medal was pinned to Calvin's worn sport coat, the entire auditorium rose in a standing ovation. Many of the younger service members had tears in their eyes, moved by the recognition of a man who had never sought. When Calvin was finally persuaded to speak, he approached the microphone with visible reluctance. I'm not much for speeches, he began haltingly, never saw the point in talking about what's already done. He paused, looking out at the sea of uniforms. I just drove, huh? He continued. That was my job. If it was a dangerous road, well, somebody had to drive it. Better me than someone with a family waiting, or some young person with their whole life ahead. He touched the medal on his chest awkwardly. But I thank you for this. I'll wear it for all the drivers who never got noticed. The military band began playing, but something unexpected happened. Calvin raised his hand, stopping them. Everyone watched in surprise as the elderly man reached into his pocket and withdrew a faded photo. Since we're remembering things, he said, his voice stronger now, I'd like to acknowledge my own team. He held up the photo. 5 men standing beside a dusty transport truck. Rogers, Martinez, Papadopoulos, Johnston, and Williams, my fellow drivers. None of them made it home. Whatever recognition you give me belongs to them too. The auditorium fell silent. General Hart stepped forward, took the photograph with reverent hands, and promised their names will be added to our memorial wall by tomorrow. Later, as the formal reception wound down, a journalist managed to ask Calvin about his future plans. Same as always, he replied with a slight smile. Friday, food pickup. Tuesday, doctor's appointment. Life doesn't change much at my age. And the truck? The reporter pressed. Any plans to upgrade now that you're something of a celebrity? Calvin looked genuinely confused by the question. Why would I get rid of my truck? We understand each other. What Calvin didn't know was that General Hart had already set in motion another plan, one that would ensure the elderly veteran never had to worry about food assistance programs or medical transportation again. Have you ever helped someone who then disappeared without a word? Tag them if you still owe them a thank you. The following Friday, Calvin arrived at the community center as usual. This time, however, the parking lot looked different. Near the entrance stood a new sign with fresh paint gleaming in the morning sun. Reserved parking for the driver who saved a general. Calvin stared at it for a long moment, before parking his truck precisely in the spot. If anyone thought it inappropriate, they kept their opinions to themselves. Inside, the usual process of collecting his food assistance box had also changed. The staff greeted him by name, no longer with the generic courtesy they extended to all recipients. Several people approached to shake his hand, including the director of the center. Mr. Rhodes, we've adjusted your benefits package, the director explained. General Hart's office contacted us about ensuring you receive comprehensive support. Calvin tried to protest. I don't need special. It's not special treatment. The director interrupted gently. It's correcting an oversight. Your service record qualifies you for benefits you've never claimed. As Calvin left with his now enhanced food package, a young man approached him in the parking lot. Sir, is it true you drove into hot zones? He asked eagerly. Calvin studied him, barely 20 with the fresh haircut of a new recruit. I drove where I was needed, Calvin replied simply. That's all. But weren't you scared? The young man persisted. Calvin considered this as he placed his groceries in the truck bed. Being scared is natural, he finally said. Acting anyway is what matters. The young man hesitated, then asked. My grandfather was in Vietnam. Logistics. Lucas Merritt. You mentioned his name in your speech. Calvin froze. Groceries forgotten. Lucas? Yes, sir. That's what they called him. Calvin's weathered hand gripped the side of the truck for support. Jimmy was the best navigator I ever knew. Could read a map in pitch darkness. Saved our hides more times than I can count. My father was born 2 months after he died, the young man said. I'm Lucas too. Shipping out next month. Calvin's eyes misted. Your grandfather would be proud. After a moment he asked, would you like to see how this old truck runs? Maybe take a short drive. For the next hour, Calvin drove through town with Lucas beside him, sharing stories about a grandfather the young man had never met, but whose legacy he carried. It was the longest conversation anyone had heard Calvin have in years. The following week brought another surprise. A team of Air Force mechanics arrived at Calvin's home with official authorization to perform maintenance on his truck. For 3 days they worked to rebuild the engine, replace worn components, and ensure every mechanical system functioned perfectly. Yet when Calvin expressed concern about the truck's appearance, the rust spots, the faded paint, the dented fender, the lead mechanic shook his head. General's orders, sir. Fix the function, preserve the character. He said. You told him an ugly truck is a truck with stories to tell. Calvin laughed for what felt like the first time in years. Sounds like something I might say. When the mechanics departed, the old truck purred like new, but looked exactly as it always had. Battle-worn, persistent, reliable, much like its own. A month after the viral moment, Calvin received an invitation to speak to new logistics recruits about his experiences. He initially declined,
insisting he had nothing worth sharing. General Hart personally called to change his mind. They need to hear from someone who understands that the most important missions often happen without fanfare, the general explained. Someone who knows that getting others home safely is victory enough. Calvin eventually agreed to a single session. He arrived at the training facility with his old cap in his hands, expecting to speak briefly and depart. Instead, he found himself in a room where the walls had been decorated with maps of every route he had driven during his service, routes that had become legendary among transport specialists for their ingenuity and daring. "We've been teaching your techniques for years," the instructor explained. "We just didn't know who created them." Calvin spoke for just 15 minutes, his message simple but profound. "I drove for this country, now I just drive to the food bank. Both matter, both have purpose." As the seasons changed, so did aspects of Calvin's quiet life. The neighbors who had barely noticed him for years now regularly stopped. A group of veterans organized a garden expansion project, adding raised beds that Calvin could tend without straining his knee. The local high school's history class invited him to share his experiences, not of combat, but of the quieter courage required to drive toward danger when instinct demands retreat. Most meaningful to Calvin was the small brass plaque that arrived 6 months after the ceremony. It had been mounted at the military transport training facility, bearing the names of his 5 fellow drivers who hadn't returned. Beneath their names was a simple inscription: "They drove so others could come home." As Calvin sat that evening on his porch, worn hands cradling a mug of lukewarm coffee, he listened to the hum of wind through the trees. He hadn't chased legacy, he had simply shown up day after day for those who needed him. And now in the twilight of his years, the world had shown up for him. Sometimes justice arrives not with fanfare, but with quiet acknowledgement, and the hands of strangers planting seeds in your yard. The truck remains Calvin's daily companion, still parked in his driveway when not in use. But now occasionally younger veterans stop by to help with his yard work, or share a cup of coffee on his porch. They seek no recognition for this, perhaps understanding better than most, that the most meaningful service often happens quietly, without ceremony or applause. And the rusty blue-silver truck, with its perfectly maintained engine hidden beneath weathered exterior, has become something of a local landmark. People point it out to visitors with newfound respect. "That's Calvin's truck. Looks nothing special, but it sure has stories to tell." Have you ever seen someone disrespected, then defended by the most powerful person present? Share a moment when you witnessed. Honor isn't about rank, but about actions. Subscribe to QH Incredible Stories, because true stories always need to be retold, and gratitude